In this video, we are going to talk about the 8 functions that make up the sort of classic Socionics Model A. So combining that with our knowledge about the 8 information elements and what those are, we'll be able to piece together the different blocks of what a type is. And I guess when I need examples, I maybe will use my own type, ILE, intuitive logical extrovert. So I'll just say what the 8 functions are in order, and then I'll go through what they are. So it's the leading function, the creative function, the role, the vulnerable, the suggestive, the mobilizing, the ignoring, and the demonstrative. So let's start with the first couple of functions. The leading and creative function. Together, these are known as the ego block. These are strong and valued functions. The leading function is what they call 4-dimensional. Creative function, 3-dimensional. Number of dimensions goes from 1 through 4. It's just sort of about how prominent that function is in their psyche, how easy it is to access. So the leading function is, sort of the core information element that is most associated with who you are. It's something that's always on. It's something that you want control over, are very opinionated about, that it's sort of always bouncing around your head or heart or being. So for example, for my type, that would be NE, extroverted intuition. That this search for novelty, for connections, for just expanding this universe of intellectual concepts sort of doesn't turn off. Even if I'd want it to turn off, it doesn't turn off very much. Turning it off for too long can sort of have an adverse effect, feel like one is stepping out of oneself. The creative function is also, strong and valued. It's something that the type likes, but unlike the leading function, it's considered more of a tool, of a means to an end. It can turn on and off. It's better willing to share space with somebody else, easier to have a conversation with somebody else, whereas the leading function is more likely to sort of want followers. For me, my creative function is TI, introverted logic. I sort of have this constant process where I am structuring things, where I'm turning things into laws, where I'm sort of vetting this consistency, this literal consistency and coherence, where I'm judging things by conscious principles. But unlike a TI lead, it's not as solid. It's just not. It's more willing to change, to adjust, or to even turn off. Like right now, making this video, I am using TI. I'm trying to proceed in an organized way. I have these structures that I'm bouncing around my head, but in my sort of rawest state, it goes back to being just any. It goes to jumping around stuff before there's any sort of order. So that's the ego block, the first 2 functions of 8. Usually the block represented after that is the superego block. I'm not particularly attached to this Freudian language, but it is. These are standard terms that you'll hear a lot, so I'll stick to them here. So the superego block is the role function and the vulnerable function. These are weak and unvalued functions. These are things that are sort of foreign agents in the psyche. The role function is the stronger of the 2. It is 2-dimensional. For me, that's SE, extroverted sensing. The role function is always going to be sort of the opposite of the leading function. There's 2 kinds of extroverted perception, NE and SE. If I lead with NE, my role function is SE. If I lead with SE, my role function is NE, and it's the same if it's an introverted judgment, introverted perception, or so on. But it is available. It's considered something that the person can do to an adequate standard, can do for a short time, can sort of get people off their back with it, but will eventually turn back to themselves before too long. If they're close to someone, that person will know who they really are. So for me, my natural state is extroverted intuition and E. Sort of this very mental thing, looking out at different phenomena, being like, oh, that's interesting. What are all the different ways we could possibly do this? Sort of opening up new paths. This very reflective sort of charging forward. Whereas SE is really taking action, going forward and doing something, whether it's in sort of the more personal, energy-driven way of SEF, or the more explicit command of that SET. It's really, it's live. It pushes, and so I can do that. I can push. Uh, I can sort of take up space with people. I can, knock out tasks. But eventually, it's a bit of a mask. Like if I try to present to someone that I am this sort of person, eventually, I will burn out, or they will see that I'm not that sort of person, or they will see the anxiety underlying those sorts of tasks. Um, the vulnerable function, on the other hand, is quite weak, one-dimensional. It's also been called, sometimes referred to as the polar, or a point of least resistance. Um, and so that, unlike the role function, which competes with leading, the vulnerable function competes for space with a creative. So it's also sort of disfavored, but it it's in a part of the psyche that takes up less space in the first place. So there just isn't that much of it. So for me, that's introvert ethics, FI. FI and TI compete with each other. They're both types of morality, types of judgment, types of decision making. FI is based on personal sentiments, on my conception of who I am, as well as just my subjective senses of like and dislike, of close and far. Uh, Whereas TI is much more uh, universal and impersonal. It's saying this thing should apply equally. Let's find a rule for this. Let's find a principle for this. Um, and yeah, so for me, this FI space of like, well, what do I actually want? What do I actually think about this person? That just doesn't occupy a lot of space. Getting into that sort of mindset is hard. It isn't to say I can't. Anyone can improve any of the 8 functions, but it just eventually I go back to myself. It's hard to stay in that mode, and I often don't even feel like I want to. I want to be like, what is the right thing to, what right way to treat this person, as if seen from outside, as if, rather than this from inside, starting from the connection, and feeling things out from that. Uh, so that's the super ego block, the role and vulnerable functions. Usually listed after that is the super id block, these 5th and 6th functions, called the suggestive and the mobilizing. These are weak and valued functions. These are things that are not, core parts of that person's standard temperament, but are sort of missing pieces for what they want, for their agenda in life, for their sort of subconscious values. The suggestive function is the weaker one of the two. That's a one-dimensional function, and that's usually framed as something that the person can't quite do for themselves effectively, even if they want to. they sort of need and are often subconsciously or maybe consciously sending out signals. Please help me a bit in this area. For me, that's SI, introverted sensing. It's hard for me to leave my many, fancy, half-baked ideas, these all these things that are catching my interests, and limit my attention to my actual surroundings, what's going on around me. And the particularly difficult to just really sit with it, connect to it, understand how I'm reacting to it physically, um, to sort of remember those things about myself and act on them. But unlike the vulnerable function, its messages land a little bit easier. Not always easily, but it's more like, oh, okay, like I was expecting you to give me this sort of information. Uh, if I trust you, at least I'm gonna accept this kind of information. Sometimes too uncritically, and I'll connect to my surroundings in this way. This is how I will, might eat my food, or this is what I might do when I'm going outside. The sort of day to day SI stuff that I'm sort of accepting guidance in it, expecting uh, someone to help me to notice the surroundings, sort of in exchange for these random ideas and insights and openings up. The mobilizing function is a bit stronger. It's two-dimensional, but still weak. And that's something that the person tries to do in sort of a situational way. If it's a situation that calls for it, they'll do it. But they're sort of insecure about it. They're looking for feedback, or if they are secure about it, then maybe they're overconfident in their abilities, because if they were truly self-aware, they would see that area their is not who they are at regular moments. It's a mode that they turn on sometimes. It's another side of them that some people don't see. Well, for me, that's FE, extroverted ethics. You may be watching this video and being like, oh, this guy is sort of speaking in a monotone. But actually, I have these very high peaks of emotionality. I've always loved performing, acting. Put me in a group of people that's having fun, and I'll often be the most striking or noticeable one in the room, sort of finding ways to liven the conversation. But the party ends, and uh, I sort of go back to being this cerebral, introverted thinker. I definitely don't have these uh, currents of passion that must be shared flowing through me all the time, like an EIE. Though I may look like an EIE temporarily, or I may want to act like that. I may effectively act like that in some scenarios, and I may even think that that's me. That's what I'm about. But someone who knows me better would be like, well, I guess that's you do that sometimes, but we only do it a little. And so it would benefit from someone who really understands these dynamic situational emotional expressions, and can sort of make tweaks to them in the right direction, or provide little prompts to it. And the last block of the four is the id block. More just random Freudian terms. I'm not really going to unpack that because I'm not really sure what the connection is. Those are strong and unvalued functions. So things that the person is competent in, but doesn't really tie their identity to, is often sort of lighter in their use. The ignoring function is the weaker of the two. It's three-dimensional, so it's still strong. I don't necessarily love the word ignoring. I don't think so the person ignores it. It's more just that they don't tend to externalize it much in conversations or emphasize it much. For me, that's introverted intuition. The ignoring function is always sort of the opposite verted version of their leading function. Like if your leading function was fi, ignoring function would be fe. So for me, because my leading function is ne, the ignoring function is ni. Like if I'm looking at the ways that a phenomenon can branch out, if I'm looking at what could I do, what is possible, then I'm not so much looking like at what is probable or really sticking to one narrative, one approach, one vision. Instead, I'm just looking out at all these approaches, all of these different visions, trying to reconcile them, trying to maybe if I bring in all these different things, then I'll understand. Then I'll have this intuitive understanding, as opposed to ni, which is really what is my understanding first. And the ne for an ni lead, it would still be there, but that would be more subtle. It'd be like, yes, I'm expanding outward to serve my own vision, my own worldview. But for me, it's I am going to in my head make some coherence out of all of these different things that I'm exploring and finding insights on. I will bring them together when I have to. I'm sort of doing that in a subtle way in my head, but uh, that's not a theme of how I talk. It's not who I am moment to moment. It's often not shared. And the eighth function, the demonstrative function, is four-dimensional but still unvalued. So that's one of the two strongest functions alongside the leading function. So that's something that's sort of always on, but it's always on more in the background. It's not as much something that uh, you always have to bring up, but it's something that's always there as a support. I personally think it works together with a creative function a lot of the time. So for me, that's TE, extroverted logic. Always interested in collecting evidence, making sense of it, doing things that increase effectiveness, making little optimizations. But unlike a TE lead, that's not the core of my personality. It's this effectiveness, this empiricism, this execution. It's something that I take into account alongside or serving this TI, this attempt to really to order things, to make things make complete sense, to have sort of short principles. But unlike a TI lead, it works more in tandem. It's really backed up more in this does it work? Is this externally right and not just internally right setting? And an analogous thing would happen with other types, and we'll get into the specifics of exactly what does happen with those other types in other videos. So those are the 8 functions. I'll just go through them again. Leading function, strong and valued, 4-dimensional. Creative function, 3-dimensional, strong and valued. The role function, 2-dimensional, a weak and unvalued. Vulnerable function, 1-dimensional, weak and unvalued. Suggestive function, 1-dimensional, weak and valued. Mobilizing function, 2-dimensional, weak, valued. Ignoring function, 3-dimensional, strong, unvalued. Then demonstrative function, 4-dimensional, strong, unvalued. And those are the basic pieces that make up a type in the classic Socionics model A. knowing the order is not too hard, because if you do think about it, if you go through examples, everything sort of follows from the first two functions. The role is, if the leading is NE, then the role is SE, suggestive SI, ignoring is NI. And then similarly, like if there would be two choices for the creative function, TI or FI. If it's FI, then vulnerable would be TI, mobilizing would be TE, and demonstrative would be FE. So there's really only these two degrees of freedom. These spots do all make sense in terms of what's competing for space and what wins. And we'll see that with different types as we continue these videos. Thanks.